Okay, so my name is Ola Arent. I come from Warsaw in Poland, but currently I'm studying landscape architecture and forestry at Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences outside of Malmö. And my art practice, because my background is in art too, and my art practice transformed into a community garden that I started in the beginning of COVID with my neighbors in Warsaw. Okay, so I would like to talk more about how community gardens could serve as alternatives to art institutions in countries like Poland and Hungary, and I guess other post-Soviet countries with the rise of authoritarianism. So since 2015 in Poland, the current ruling party has taken over, and they're called Law and Justice, and you may have heard about them in the media, that they just try to just take away human rights, like with delegalizing abortion, changing law, and now with Polish-Belarusian border crisis, just using very harsh limitations on everyone. And the same obviously happens with culture. So since 2015, they've been progressively replacing directors of the biggest contemporary art institutions, as well as theaters and schools. So everything that builds culture is slowly transformed into means for very right-wing propaganda. And so that's one way to take over the buildings. The other way is to take away funding, which slowly also destroys the institutions, and then they will eventually replace the directors. But that works with national institutions, not municipality-owned institutions. So I come from Warsaw, so within Warsaw that happened to Ujazdowski Center for Contemporary Art 2 or 3 years ago. So from a very progressive art institution focusing on politics, climate change, migration crisis, etc., it got transformed into an institution that exhibits artists that, for example, still miss Hitler. So it's not going the right direction. And the same with Zachęta National Art Gallery, from maybe not as progressive institution as the Ujazdowski, also from rather also quite progressive institution. Since a few months, there's a new director who's a painter, a painter who paints self-portraits, and he's going to now be the director of this institution. And I think in the last month, they also replaced the director of Art Museum in Łódź, which is quite also an international institution with many links to other MoMAs around Europe, and that's been replaced with a guy who was also running some, I think, painting-related gallery in a small village. So they just try to put incompetent people in powerful positions, and so there's less and less space for tackling issues like climate change, for example, in this case. But that also applies to some Western art museums where, because of corporate sponsorship from pharmaceutical companies or oil companies, for example with Tate Modern with Sackler family, or British Museum with, I think, BP, there's also limitations on what topics you can debate in those institutions. So I think they're also censored in a way. So I think a community garden, it's a naive solution, but it is some alternative to indoor white cube art institutions, because they're cheaper, you don't need to maintain the buildings. You also can't invigilate them constantly. So in a way, for practices like performance art or talks, you can, in a way, get more freedom, because the practices could just vanish in time. And you can also get funding from other sources, sources for more landscape architecture or for farming, So that could also be another source of funding culture in the times when funding is given in Poland to more Catholic organizations than culture organizations. So for example, if in your project you have the name of Polish Pope John Paul II appearing, you have bigger chance of getting funding than, for example, if you say women's rights or ecology. And then another thing is that, this is a generalization, but I think many art institutions don't keep up with political debate and still stick to exhibiting modern art, unfortunately. So I think working directly with nature and in nature could be like a faster transition than, for example, making exhibitions about nature in Cézanne, which doesn't teach you about nature, but just sticks to the status quo. So yeah, I think there's a big potential in community gardens, since I ran a community garden since over 2 years. It's been quite effective in debating issues, including art, because you just work with them in the process. So it's very easy to understand food networks or problems related also to forestry and to plants. So I think in a way, at least from my perspective, it could be easier to educate audience with these topics by experience rather than through very complicated artworks that many people for example, my family, if they go to art museums, they often don't understand anything, even though the topics could be familiar to them. So I think this is in a way more accessible. But also since many artworks are still, even if they tackle the topic of climate change, they still often do it in traditional media, like video or photography. And I feel like those are not relevant anymore, since the issue is very current. So I think culture could just contribute to the green transition of our cities instead of just focusing on mimesis or research, because research is still done by scientists, so someone is taking care of it. So I think we could just help instead of theorizing about things, because we have creativity and power to also change the cities. So another good thing about community gardens is that instead of exploiting nature, for example, with pigments or photographing nature, we can ask the participants, insects or fungi, to create space around. So in a community garden, artist works as a process starter, and then the rest is you work with the maintenance with the neighbors, but other creatures are also building the experiment with us. So I think that's also very important. So this is my community garden from Warsaw. So we started it through land grabbing from the city of Warsaw. So we just went there at the beginning of COVID and took the land. And since then we were cultivating the soil there and growing vegetables and building water retention and organizing various workshops. And we were learning in the process of making it, so none of us were professionals then, but now we're on the way to becoming more professional in this field. So yeah, we use permaculture, I guess, like many people are interested in these things. And apart from learning together about ecology, what's important for us is teaching the neighbors about land grabbing for example, from lawns. Like Maya said, in cities there's a lot of unused lawns. So through being more brave and willing to experiment, we can just transform a lot of city spaces spontaneously without permission. But the good thing is that in the last 3 years, we've been trying to get permissions and more funding. So now the city has accepted us as an initiative. So from something illegal, we became recognized. So it proves that it's worth land grabbing in cities, at least in Warsaw. Yeah, so that's, and also anti-aesthetics is an important thing in this garden. So I think that's a bit more related to art. Because many people, also relating to what Maya said, like are very used to like very strict, controlled gardens. So I think through like just interacting with more chaotic spaces and dirt, we can also try to experiment more with building the future and like understanding that if we allow like other species to work with us, it may be not as controlled as we want it to be, but it could also become something probably more valuable. So these are other species. So for example, this thing here in the corner, these are traces of a wild boar, because in Warsaw we have wild boars, and the wild boar comes every day and destroys our vegetable beds. But that also acts as a conversation starter, because like we just have to accept the wild boar. We're not going to shoot it. So like the wild boar becomes a creator of the space too, just like in forests. And here's a species growing on a hawthorn that, like living on a hawthorn, it's that species of, I think, moths that create those big nets on trees and to protect their eggs. So then that's another, I would call artwork, because it's like an installation built by the insects. So then the garden becomes like a gallery space, but just created by, yeah, like humans and non-humans. And yeah, this is some ornithology adventure and other insects that, yeah, they just like manipulate the plants on daily basis. So I think they just have to be accepted as co-creators. And yeah, we organize a lot of community events to get more people involved and just to share the ideology with them. Yeah, and these are objects we create spontaneously that could also be a sort of sculpture park, but with more, like, it's pragmatic, but yes. And yeah, a lot of workshops in making, for example, potions, like potions for like gardening, which are also very performative. But so I think that's another thing that is very artistic. Yeah. So, but there's a lot of art initiatives that are like environmental activism in Poland. So, for example, this one in the corner, this is a project I took part in last year, and it was a short residency on the side of a coal mine in Poland on the border of Germany that was sued to the EU and lost. So there, through the creative practices, we also try to raise awareness and like also think about the futures for the coal mine and work with the local community. On the bottom, it's a group called Siostry Rzeki, the River Sisters, and they, through performative practices, singing and protests, they protect rivers in Poland. Another initiative here is called Zakole Wawerskie. That's in Warsaw. There's a very big swamp in Warsaw, and they organize experimental walks and, yeah, amongst other things, to protect the swamp. And this one is in the Polish mountains. It's a part of a festival called Context, and this is my project within the festival. And that was, I collaborated with a butterfly breeder, and we took a walk around the mountains to talk how local forestry practices cause disappearance of butterfly species. So, yes, and this is a initiative called Flow, and it's also an art residency it's a boat that every year sails on the rivers to also tackle the issues of surrounding rivers. And this is what I would like to finish with. I think this is a good way to build institutions, and it's an institution I work at currently in Malmö, and it's called Botildenborg. And the idea is to have an institution because there's a lot of migrants coming to Malmö since 2014. So this institution helps them find their way in Malmö through growing food together. But also there's a lot of educational practices. This is very far from art, but I think that in these days, this kind of institutions are very necessary. So I think if art institutions went a bit more towards social sustainability and sustainability in general, it could be some good way to better future. Thank you.
Okay. And what would be your question you would like to maybe hear also from the others?
Maybe what should art institutions of the future look like?